has it been built like that? Is it so you can change it when you've had enough?
Is it a nightclub? A prison?
I can't imagine listening to Beethoven's Fifth in there.
In almost 40 years of existence, the Centre Pompidou has left no one unmoved. Love it or hate it, you can't ignore it. Initially scorned, it now draws tourists from all over the world. The Centre Pompidou in the heart of the capital, an oddity in the centre of Paris, simultaneously a museum, library, cinema and living space. It is the story of a project that almost never saw the light of day. A building that owes its existence to a unique set of circumstances. The story begins with one man's vision, but how would Georges Pompidou, whose political views were solidly conservative, impose his resolutely modern taste in contemporary art?
There is nothing more dreadful than academic art which is not challenging, which is art that accepts. Art must discuss, must contest, must protest.
Hundreds of architects, including the era's biggest names, entered the competition to bring this extraordinary project to life. To everyone's surprise, the winning design was a highly idealistic project dreamt up by two radical young architects who, up to then, had seen few of their designs actually built.
More than just a building, a system. You know, something very free, that can be renovated, that can change with situations and time.
The Centre Pompidou is the incredible saga of the construction of a monument dedicated to modern and contemporary art that today has become a masterpiece of architecture, an icon of 20th century art. The adventure began in the 1960s. In the spring of 1962, the French caught a first glimpse of their new Prime Minister, who until then was virtually unknown, on the television news. During a press conference on the steps of l'Élysée, which was almost invisible behind the scrum of photographers, Georges Pompidou spoke to the people of France for the first time.
General de Gaulle, the President of the Republic, has just named me Prime Minister and has requested that I form the government.
At the age of 51, he was a total novice in politics. Until that point, he had been Director General of the Rothschild Merchant Bank.
At first, he wasn't expected to last long in his new job of Prime Minister. His image was still that of a banker and the director of the Rothschild Bank. And the opposition never missed an opportunity to point it out.
Just a few years later, this follower of de Gaulle, with his air of bourgeois respectability, would bring into being one of the most avant-garde buildings of the 20th century. As head of the government, Georges Pompidou wanted to modernize France. He developed the motorway network and the public transport systems, such as the Parisian RER. And he developed the business district at La Défense, as well as commissioning large housing estates. Within this vast modernization program, the one area that escaped him was culture, which was the preserve of his minister, André Malraux. At that time, this man of letters was focused essentially on the country's wealth of existing heritage. He had launched a vast and ambitious restoration plan for the Parisian monuments, which for decades had been covered in a layer of black soot. The poor relation of his cultural policy was contemporary art, which was almost non-existent in Paris.
Very few of the more interesting works of contemporary art were ever shown in Paris. There were some galleries, but still a very small number. It wasn't at all worthy of a city like Paris, compared with New York during the same era.
Since the 1950s, Paris was no longer the undisputed capital of the art world. Now it was all happening on the other side of the Atlantic. with the appearance of new avant-garde movements such as the action painting of Jackson Pollock, and then pop art. In New York, Andy Warhol and Roy Lichtenstein were shaking up modern art, ironically playing with the symbols of a consumer society. At this time in France, the early 1960s, young artists like Jean-Pierre Reynaud were struggling to survive. The man who would some years later become a reference point in contemporary art was fascinated by the dynamism of the American art scene.
On avait toujours les yeux tournés vers l'Amérique, qui avait là quand même pris de l'ampleur.
Our eyes were always on America, which by that time had really gained in status. And over there, with their flagship of pop art, they were really hitting us hard at that time. It was heavy artillery they were using, and it was fresh, luminous, cheerful, young. So France really did seem a bit old-fashioned in comparison.
There was a collection of modern art in Paris. Since the city's liberation in 1945, it had been housed next to the Louvre and its rich classical collections in the Palais de Tokyo. In its rooms, visitors could admire the works of great masters like Picasso, Braque or Matisse. Artists who'd been at the forefront of the scene for several decades. It was as if time had stopped between the two wars in the last years of Cubism, Paris's golden age.
Il y avait le musée d'art moderne qui faisait bon.
There was the Museum of Modern Art, but it was a bit old hat. It was the end of something. It was conservative. It wasn't at all stimulating.
C'était pas stimulant du tout.
C'était un très beau musée.
It was a very beautiful museum with magnificent collections, but they were very small in comparison with the scope of modern and contemporary art. When I was studying history of art at the National Museum of Modern Art, I didn't see the works that I wanted to see there.
In the 1960s, the Paris Museum of Modern Art struggled to attract 100,000 visitors a year, an extremely low figure next to the huge success of its counterpart in New York. During the same era, MoMA was welcoming 40 times more people, with 4 million visitors a year. In comparison, the French exhibitions seemed to belong to another era.
There were no photos because the National Library was in charge of photography. There was no video or cinema because no one knew what it was. There was no drawing, no documentation because for the curators the library was enough. In other words, their hands were tied on every side. So the criticism got louder and louder and the artists got more and more fed up.
Ignored by French museums, young artists had to travel abroad to have their work recognised. Like Nikki de Saint-Phal in Sweden. It was at the Moderna Museet that she made On, a monumental reclining and provocative woman. For his part, Jean-Pierre Reynaud went to New York to show what he called his psycho-objects. Installations that obsessively multiplied symbols such as no entry signs.
I went to the United States in 1965 and miraculously I saw Warhol. I was at the factory. The Rolling Stones were there. It was really everything that was going on in music and also in art. And things didn't stop there. I met Marcel Duchamp in New York, who invited me to his place. We had an extraordinary lunch together. I spent 2 hours with him. I had an incredible exhibition straight away. The MoMA commissioned a piece that was 4 meters long, which it keeps in its collections.
Faced with America's omnipotence, de Gaulle's Minister of Culture, André Malraux, wanted to preserve France's artistic prestige by creating the Museum of the 20th Century. he asked the architect Le Corbusier to dust off a project from the 1930s, the Museum of Unlimited Growth. It was a construction in the form of a square spiral that could grow with the collections. Malraux envisaged this museum being at the city gates of Paris at La Défense. Le Corbusier, however, wanted to locate his building in the heart of the capital. Provocatively, he even suggested demolishing the Grand Palais. But just a few months later, in August 1965, the architect died. His 20th century museum died with him. Georges Pompidou would never forget the idea of a museum in the very heart of Paris. A staunch modernist, he was one of the rare French politicians of the era who enjoyed modern art. He made his preferences clear as soon as he arrived at the Prime Minister's official residence, the Hôtel Matignon. He shone a brilliant spotlight on French art, starting with his own office.
Little by little, in fact, Georges Pompidou imposed his own personal choice, particularly with the decoration of his office at Matignon as soon as he arrived. This caused quite a stir because normally the Prime Minister's office is hung with 18th century tapestries, a very traditional decor, but he asked for a painting by Soulages to be brought in.
The Soulages canvas is abstract, sombre. A style of painting so contemporary that it clashed with all the gilding at the Hôtel Matignon. Provocatively, Georges Pompidou enjoyed hanging it over his desk, next to the 17th century tapestries. As they entered, visitors would see this work straight away, the last thing you would expect in the Prime Minister's residence. But he took a mischievous delight in observing their reaction. Georges Pompidou and his wife Claude were very well-informed collectors of modern art. In their apartment, they lived surrounded by artwork, including sculptures by Niki de Saint-Phal, installations by Vasarely, or pop art by Martial Reyes.
No one was interested in modernity, in fact. He was someone who actually lived in modernity. The apartment of the Quai de Béthune was filled with paintings and paintings which they'd bought, whether it was the magnificent Martial Reyes from the 1960s that was in the living room, or they had a real taste for it.
Georges Pompidou, the public man, never missed an opportunity to promote the French artists that he liked.
That you see that. Do you know what it is? It's a Renault. It expresses a sort of materialism in modern society. It's enclosing, imprisoning, threatening.
I exhibited in a gallery called Galerie Matthias Fell on Boulevard Haussmann. And one day the gallery owner said that Georges Pompidou had passed by and had fallen in love with one of my pieces. Obviously, I was astounded. I was very, very happy. It was, of course, very reassuring to feel that power could also be something other than simple power. It could also be culture.
In art, Pompidou saw a way to understand the era, to feel the mood of the times. This right-winger was also passionate about works that were hostile towards his political ideas. A staunch anti-communist, he did not hesitate to show the Maoist film La Chinoise by Jean-Luc Godard at Matignon in 1967.
Essentially, art is always more or less a way to question things, and if it was a matter of saying, yes, well done, or that's admirable, it would be boring. There is nothing more dreadful than academic art, which is not challenging, which is art that accepts. Art must discuss, must answer, must protest, that's for sure.
Pompidou was a conservative who had a real taste for creative invention. He said that art was an extension of the self, which could end up creating a contradiction of oneself. He meant that there was power in art, something that stretched us, highlighting things that did not necessarily apply to our lives, but that would awaken us to another life.
A few months after the scandalous showing of La Chinoise at Matignon, history seemed to catch up with this Prime Minister for whom art had to challenge the established order. In a country that was said to be asleep, the youth rose up and expressed its despair for this rigid society. May 1968. In just a few weeks, France violently contested the authority of General de Gaulle. The students' revolt, rapidly followed by the workers' revolt, made the authorities falter. The artists followed next. They challenged the universities and academies which they accused of working for the state. The School of Fine Arts responded, covering the walls with graphic displays with hard-hitting slogans that have since become the symbols of that revolt. General de Gaulle, who favoured a rapid suppression of the unrest, seemed quickly overtaken by events. Georges Pompidou, for his part, preferred to play the moderation card and gambled on allowing the movement to peter out on its own.
Pompidou, thanks to his interest in contemporary forms of expression, had feelers which gave him a better grasp of the situation and enabled him to prioritize the problems well. He made sure that events didn't spiral out of control, that there were no deaths. It was really the memory of the role he played in 1968 that made the French choose him to succeed General de Gaulle.
On the 15th of June 1969, Georges Pompidou was elected President of the Republic with a broad majority. He would finally be able to launch a project that was particularly close to his heart. He was convinced that a society more open to art is a society that can modernize, and he was to proclaim this view in an interview with Le Monde newspaper, a real declaration of faith.
I would passionately like Paris to have a cultural centre that is both a museum and a centre for creation, where the plastic arts would stand alongside music, cinema, books and audiovisual research. I am struck by the conservative nature of French taste, and particularly by those we would call the elite, who have been outraged by government art policy for the past 100 years.
For him, a society that was incapable of having a natural rapport with the creations of its time was a society that was going to struggle even more to modernize itself. So for Georges Pompidou, during the 30 glorious years of the post-war boom, the challenge was to modernize France and therefore, in his view, to create an institution that would help the French to better understand modern art. When we say the French, we're really talking about society as a whole. It was an institution that will be at the service of the country's modernization policy.
A staunch modernist, Pompidou knew that the French, too conservative in matters of art, were not ready for his cultural centre. So he would have to impose it. He wanted to move very quickly, convinced that if he waited, the project would never happen.
À ce moment-là, c'était ce qu'il fallait faire.
At that time, it was what had to be done. It had to be pushed through by force. With the French, it was certainly the only solution, because they were very divided. I think there would have been a lot of resistance over creating a very progressive museum like that. So there would have to be endless debates, and I think that would have been the end of it. It would never have happened.
The final decision was where in Paris to build this new type of centre. Always aiming for efficiency, he turned towards one of the rare spaces available in the centre of the city. Pompidou decided to acquire by preemption a piece of wasteland in the Marais quarter. The Plateau Beaubourg, a few streets away from the Pavilion Baltard. The Pompidous had already noted this area some time before.
J'allais le chercher à son bureau
Et pour revenir à la maison.
I used to go and meet him at his office at the end of the day, and as we lived in the Marais quarter, to get home we passed through what is called the Plateau Beaubourg. At that time it was huge and a rather sinister place of wasteland, and he often said, what a shame that the government doesn't do something, build a huge library or cultural centre.
Un ensemble culturel.
This quarter, reconstructed here in this model, is one of the oldest in the capital. In the Middle Ages, it was nicknamed the Beaubourg, the beautiful village, to mock its narrow and dark passageways. Having become unsanitary over time, the quarter was finally torn down in 1930. 40 years later, in December 1969, still nothing had been built there. It was still just wasteland.
You have to remember that the Plateau Beaubourg, before the decision to build the Pompidou Centre, was one of the filthiest places in Paris. Truly dreadful. It was a square that had been all but abandoned. It was like a wasteland. There was a large population of homeless people. It was a bit scary, not very safe.
It was a totally deprived area. For a long time, the Plateau Beaubourg was a sort of car park, and it was the ugliest side of the whole quarter surrounding Les Halles. Rue Quincampoix was full of prostitutes, which, in a sense, was rather quaint. But that all made it hard to imagine that this could ever become a place that was full of life.
Despite its reputation, the plateau seemed to be the ideal place to locate what Georges Pompidou was already calling the Centre Beaubourg. But it turned out that the place was already sought after.
This area, in the centre of Paris, looked empty, but nothing is ever completely empty. There are always projects. He discovered that there was a project for a large public reading library, which was indeed lacking in Paris, and which had been planned for this site. So he decided to marry the two projects. In other words, to combine the idea of a museum of modern art with the library project. Georges Pompidou already had the idea that a library would encourage people to visit.
Now all that was left was to decide who was going to build this great presidential project. Georges Pompidou surprised everybody by choosing to hold an international competition. This was a first for France.
The Beaubourg Centre is the contemporary art centre which President Georges Pompidou wants to create. The programme will be sent to 20,000 architects in France and across the world, so that they can communicate their projects and ideas.
Every ambassador was rallied to take this competition to the four corners of the world. The competition was open to all architects, and what was more surprising, it was decided that the entries should be anonymous. Moreover, it was not the president who would choose the laureate, but a prestigious jury, a unique occurrence in the history of the Fifth Republic. So that the decision would be indisputable, legends of architecture were brought together, such as the Brazilian Oscar Niemeyer, responsible for the city of Brasilia, and the American Philip Johnson, who constructed the legendary Seagram building in New York. But the person who would have the most influence over the final result was the president of the jury, Jean Prouvé, a designer and architect renowned for his research into industrial habitats. The operation was an immense success. 681 projects were sent from around the world with very varied proposals.
It was a really major competition. It was incredible, and it was insanely successful, giving rise to all sorts of projects from every school, every discipline, every space, every size, every symbol.
The jurors worked ceaselessly for 3 days on these plans and models, some of which seemed as though they'd been taken right out of a science fiction novel. This is what the Centre Beaubourg could have looked like. On this one, the whole square is covered with an immense mesh. This other project placed the centre underneath gardens and terraces. For some buildings, the shapes were audacious. This one offered a sort of giant parasol. Others resembled a nuclear power station. And there was even one building in the shape of an egg.
We were faced with approximately 680 projects, and we discovered very quickly that we were averse to big architectural gestures. We were drawn to simplicity.
Faced by this wide range of choices, the jury focused on a project that held its full attention. Number 493. It was clearly distinguished from all the others by a strong idea.
Le jury choisit ce projet absolument radical.
The jury chose this absolutely radical project, and they chose it because it was the only one out of some 660 projects to propose that only half of the available plot was built upon. The other half would be transformed into an urban piazza that would bring the city into the museum.
La ville à l'intérieur du musée.
Most of the projects didn't manage to fit all of the contents within one building, and so they took up the whole space. And so the truly major idea was to say the ground must be freed up and we have to build high, even if it means breaking through the ceiling.
Breaking through the Paris ceiling, which meant exceeding the construction limit of 25 metres, the height of a Haussmannian building. The building would therefore dominate the skyline, which was far from insignificant. The Paris skyline is a uniform height and thus appears to be flat. Throughout the centuries, only those constructions deemed sacred could exceed this ceiling, churches and cathedrals, or at the end of the 19th century, the Eiffel Tower, symbolic of the triumph of science. The Beaubourg Centre would be the future cathedral of culture. The symbolism was powerful. What pleased the jury was that it already seemed to have found its place in the city.
It's a huge building, but it follows the urban framework. In other words, it's a rectangle. It doesn't have a strange shape. It's simultaneously completely out of the ordinary, but very urban.
What also impressed the jurors was how radical the proposal was. A giant building opening onto the city through its huge glass windows. Each floor is an immense, unobstructed plateau that can be modified at will, offering shared spaces and decompartmentalizing both art and culture.
It is an open-plan building. Each level is open plan, the size of 2 football fields. This was one of the architect's arguments, which was to say, we're offering you, particularly for the museum, a space that is completely new. You are almost in the open air, in an open-plan space.
It was the choice of the total flexibility of the space. They were totally free plateaus that could be adapted to uses that were as yet not really defined. The programme was voluntarily left open to free the plateaus. All of the technical infrastructure that is normally hidden was displaced to the exterior.
The jury's deliberations were brief. After 3 days, on the 15th of July 1971, Project 493 was chosen with an almost unanimous vote, 8 out of 9 votes. So who, therefore, was the brilliant winner?
And in the end, they approved this anonymous project. So no one knew at all who it was. It was clear that it was a young, vibrant character, but no one knew who it was.
When the identity of the candidates was revealed, the jury was a jury of skilled personalities. But who knew Piano Rogers? No one.
The winners of the biggest competition in architecture ever held in France were 2 unknowns. A young Italian of 33 years old, Renzo Piano, and an Englishman scarcely any older, Richard Rogers, 35 years old. Until that time, neither of them had built very much. Piano, who was the son of a Genoese stonemason, had started in the family business before working for architects in Britain and the US. The previous year, he had just worked with his brother on the Italian pavilion of the Osaka World Fair, an exercise in lightness with steel and polyester. That was where he met Richard Rogers. This English architect had mostly designed houses around London, like this one in Wimbledon, in an industrial style. The two men shared a distinct taste for modern construction methods. At the time, they had just designed these offices in Italy that heralded the appearance and the colours of the centre. To everyone's surprise, the state therefore gave the keys to this giant building site for the Beaubourg Centre, 100,000 square metres of construction, to two young and inexperienced architects.
How do two young men win a competition like that? Renzo Piano said one thing to me, just one little sentence that summarizes his point of view at the time. We were young, we wanted to smack them in the mouth with it. And that's what they did. They pushed the physical aspect of the building to the extreme. They weren't expecting it at all, meaning that they threw themselves into it a bit like young people do to get people talking about them. So they hoped to be noticed, but probably not to win. They expected to be considered somewhat banal, and then there was a black Citroën DS waiting outside for them.
I remember the day that we went to welcome the team of architects who were there with a beard and long hair. It was marvellous for us because we were the same age, and so that was okay, but to others that had to look a bit strange.
Piano tells the story of one of the team who was dressed in a T-shirt with a yellow canary on it, not really the style of the presidential protocol. So it was a bit of a culture shock.
Welcomed with great ceremony by the French officials, the architects were besieged by the cameras. Renzo Piano, the only one of the two to speak any French, tried hard to explain the concept of his modular building.
La première chose qu'on a cherché de faire, c'était de faire justement plus qu'un bâtiment, un système. Vous savez, quelque chose de très libre, de se rénover, de se changer avec les situations, avec le temps. Comme ça, ce bâtiment, c'est exactement, peut-être, au moins, dans l'intention, c'est exactement le contraire d'un monument.
This anti-monument, described by Renzo Piano, which breaks with classical architecture, made direct reference to something he read when he was young. A magazine that has now become legendary, Archigram. This underground UK publication made of collages and drawings embodies the architectural utopias of the 1960s. In its pages, projects for an exuberant urbanism mixed inflatable structures, flying cities, and modular buildings, and sang the praises of networks and mobility. These utopian principles were to have a great influence on the architecture of the Beaubourg Centre.
Archigram was the idea of technological modernity that would be more amusing, leaning more towards pop culture with the colours, for example. They came from Archigram. This sort of idea that, well, why would you make architecture in black and white when the world is full of colour?
None of these ideas went beyond the paper stage, but one of the projects deeply touched the two young architects. Imagined 10 years earlier in 1961 by Englishman Cedric Price, Fun Palace was a sort of futuristic art centre. In these drawings we find several influences for the Pompidou Centre, like the supporting metal frame, the wide open spaces and the escalators.
And this effectively was the direct inheritance from all these architecture firms who between the 1950s and 1960s tried to imagine architecture that was more fun, postmodern, eminently modular, pluggable architecture. And evidently, the Centre Pompidou is the direct heritage of these utopian architectural designs.
There is one important thing that must be understood. It is not at all the world that French architecture is immersed in, which means that the French are completely ignorant of this type of thing.
In a country that swears only by concrete, a large building of steel and glass ruffled people's feathers. Even the modernist Georges Pompidou was disconcerted by the models created for the competition that he so wanted.
When President Pompidou met the winning architects from the competition, his opinion was evidently the most important because it had been his idea. He said to Renzo Piano and Rogers that he was not particularly enamored of their architecture, that it was not necessarily his cup of tea, but that as long as he lived, no one would touch a hair of this project.
Pompidou was absolutely remarkable in this regard because I think that when he was shown the first model, the panels from the competition, he wondered whether it was even doable.
At the Grand Palais, curious crowds flocked in their hundreds to see the models for the new arts centre. Unaccustomed as they were to such audacity, the public were clearly sceptical.
Moi, je crois que c'est l'erreur monumentale du siècle. J'entends pas d'avance la cinquième de Beethoven là-dedans ou le sacre du printemps.
C'est une boîte, une prison. On fera des expériences comme sur des lapins ou comme dans les hôpitaux psychiatriques.
Evidently, what was going to be the most striking was the fact that it was a building with its innards on the outside. People talked of the petrol refinery or even Our Lady of Pipework. Anyway, the taxi drivers were all competing to come up with the most ingenious nickname for it.
This sort of factory, as they called it at the time, which rose above the rooftops of Paris, many people still thought it was horrendous. It was a crime of treason. It triggered the same sorts of reactions as the Eiffel Tower.
Attacks from part of the press multiplied against what was then nicknamed the Monster of the Marais. It was the start of a controversy that would last throughout the build. Meanwhile, Piano and Rogers had to get to work. In fact, they had to finalize the project, to convert this beautiful model into precise plans before starting work. The scope of the competition had turned the world's spotlight onto them, and the pressure was reaching its peak. The two architects would have to dedicate themselves entirely to their project, and so they moved to Paris, cut off from their respective families. The first months were difficult because the French authorities did not really trust these men in their 30s, who they found eccentric and too lacking in experience.
Ça se passe mal.
It went badly. Let's be clear, it went quite badly because firstly they arrived with a very Anglo-Saxon culture where the architect is completely responsible for the entire project. For example, in Anglo-Saxon architecture, it is the architect who hires the engineers and so who has the last word in a very clear way. In France, it's a much more complex interaction between the architect, the design department and the company, so that in the end there is often less responsibility on the part of the architects. So it went quite badly. They didn't understand very well. People tried to impose things on them, and they were close to breaking point on several occasions.
Piano and Rogers quickly faced difficulties. The first concerned the piazza, which had so pleased the jury. It posed a serious problem for the city prefecture, who did not appreciate there being so much space for pedestrians. For Piano, it was non-negotiable. This space was inextricably linked with the Beaubourg project. The Italian was inspired by the Piazza del Campo in Siena in Tuscany, as he liked its gentle slope, inclined like an amphitheatre. For him, this gentle slope was far from a small detail. It represented the very spirit of the project, a strong sign of openness sent to the public.
Dans les musées.
In classical museums, which are like temples, we climb towards the museum, a sort of assumption which is also a bit discouraging for members of the public who are not familiar with museums. Here it is the total opposite. We descend towards the museum.
And that is where they undoubtedly rejoined the vision of the authorities, of the president, to ensure that culture could reach the masses. How could they do this? By making it clear that this machine was approachable, open. The biggest problem in getting the piazza to work involved another aspect, removing the traffic, and that was very difficult at the time.
At the start of the 1970s in Paris, cars reigned supreme and were devouring more and more space. So the idea of creating a pedestrian island in the heart of the capital seemed absurd. But the architects weren't going to let go of their piazza. Of the 4 roads surrounding the centre, 3 had to be closed off to cars. To the prefect of Paris, this was sacrilege. He refused to cut the circulation of traffic on the road that ran along the piazza, threatening to disrupt the harmony of the project.
The piazza was completely foreign to the dynamics of Paris. It had been forgotten. But Haussmann's legacy is for open spaces in Paris to be crossroads. If you look at Place de la Concorde, there's no piazza. There are no Italian-style piazzas which are pedestrian spaces. So it really was something completely new.
On this point, Piano and Rogers would have their way, but under constant pressure, they progressively amended their project, even starting to make serious concessions. After 1 year, the new model that they presented to the French officials demonstrated this. Their massive building had changed a great deal. It was much less radical than the original project. The centre now had 1 floor less. The escalator was less imposing, and it doesn't yet have the snail shape that would make it so renowned. Above all, the building had more curves. The architects had, in the true sense, smoothed the project's rough edges.
They tried to please everyone, so they rounded, softened. It started to look like one of the dreadful projects that were built at the start of the 1970s, and so they finally understood that they were heading for disaster.
In 1972, President Pompidou was becoming impatient. There was no question of wasting any more time. Work had begun, even if the architecture was still changing. The few unsanitary buildings surrounding the Plateau Bourbon were torn down under watchful eyes, intrigued by the extent of the work, and the builders dug an immense hole to welcome the future underground car park. In order to stop the project drifting, Georges Pompidou decided to give the architects his full support in dealing with the French administration. He gave them full control of the building site, allowing them, with their team, to be the only masters of the ship. In an unexpected blow, work on site came to an abrupt halt. An administrative tribunal had ordered the interruption. The issue? A complaint from candidates unhappy about the competition. Grouped under the name of the Association of the Architectural Gesture, they took the matter to a tribunal. Created on the day following Piano and Rogers' victory, the association considered the project retained to be too functional, that this immense modular meccano was not even worthy of being called architecture.
There were architects who believed in the architectural gesture and who represented quite a large proportion of French architectural practice, of which the French Pavilion in Montreal had been an example. It was something quite lyrical with, honestly, the contents not being very important. But that makes an impact on the panorama. And instead of that, what did they offer? A factory. There was a sort of desperate attempt with a trial, in fact, carried out by one of them to say, it's not architecture. You're running an architecture competition and you've chosen something that's not architecture.
To bring the works to a halt, the unhappy architects' argument was based on a legal loophole. They were relying on the successive modifications of the escalator, accusing the architects of being too far from the original proposition. But after 4 months, the State Council stepped in and authorized the work to restart. This episode would galvanize Piano and Rogers. A few months later, at the end of 1973, the two architects presented a new version of their project. Their final model was a radical response to the conservatism of their opponents. Proudly, while they were reproached for the purely utilitarian aspect of their centre, they delivered a real treatise on functional architecture. Instead of hiding the building's different functions, like the ventilation or the heating, they decided to put them on show. For them, it was the use of the building that had to define the architecture.
It was a version of the technology where function becomes visible. It was an inversion of the standard formula which consisted of covering all the building's functions, the pipes, the air conditioning, the heating. They inverted the normal order and put everything on the outside. It clearly became a machine, but a machine for culture.
From this point forward, the entire facade was covered in pipes. And to highlight the building's different functions, the architects came up with a colour code. Blue for ventilation and air conditioning. Green for water pipes. Yellow for electricity. And red for public walkways. Like under the central escalator, the caterpillar. It finally took its definitive form, tracing an elegant diagonal line across the building. Today, it has become its symbol, giving it an almost poetic dimension. Effectively, the caterpillar surpassed its simple function as a mechanical staircase. By dramatizing the break through the Parisian ceiling, the architects found the way to make the public physically feel that by taking the escalator, they were raising themselves up towards culture.
That was Le Corbusier, who tried to put as few staircases as possible in his individual houses and to use gentle ascents. He called them architectural walkways, and the escalator is the most beautiful architectural walkway in Paris.
The escalator crystallizes something that is the dream of the megastructure, where you are simultaneously in technology and, thanks to technology, free and in contact with the elements. Because essentially the escalator climbs towards the sky like a bird that jumps from branch to branch. And so there is a side that is both very technological and there is a side where you leave the technology to rediscover nature in some way. It's very magical, and yes, it's one of the most astonishing things about this building.
In 1974, 3 years after the competition, the building still had not broken ground. Another major blow could even have been fatal for it.
The president has been very courageous. The last time I saw him, he put his head down and said, "Oh, it's hard what I'm doing."
On the 2nd of April 1974, the President of the Republic died from an illness which he had kept secret until his last day. Georges Pompidou disappeared without ever having seen the art centre that he so ardently wanted to have in the heart of the capital. His successor, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, elected 2 months later, was far from sharing the same dream. The new president did not like either contemporary art nor modern architecture, and he soon made it known.
There was a worrying moment at the time of the death of Georges Pompidou when Giscard d'Estaing, who was, as everyone knows, very attentive to Paris's ceiling, and when he saw that, he tried to stop or to limit the project.
Before it was too late, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing wanted to stop the construction of the future centre, but his Prime Minister, Jacques Chirac, who was loyal to Georges Pompidou, would prevent him from doing so. Cleverly, he passed a law through the French National Assembly that would make this building untouchable. His trick was to rename it. On the 3rd of January 1971, the deputies for the Conservative majority adopted a new name for the Centre Beaubourg. It became the Centre Georges Pompidou.
Le fait de tout de suite baptiser son projet de son nom.
Giving the project his name straight away limited, let's say, possible attacks from the government.
construction could finally begin. In Paris, the giant pieces that made up the skeleton of this monster of the Marais arrived in convoys in the middle of the night.
They're him actually doing what he was doing, and I actually read a transcript from a lecture that Roy gave a few.
Girders were made in one piece, so they were transported through Paris in the middle of the night. They came from Germany by train and then by road, and there were monumental cranes on site.
A veritable mechanical ballet commenced amid the buildings of Paris. The whole thing resembled a child's toy, but on an incredible scale. The workers started by erecting the immense pillars that stood more than 40 meters tall. Then some impressive cranes had to attach the trusses that each weighed more than 75 tons and which would support the plateaus. But since it was impossible to bear a weight like that, a special piece was created to distribute the weight, the so-called géberette. A pivoting system designed by Piano and Rogers that was particularly ingenious.
They are pieces with somewhat organic shapes, and so you have a sort of contrast between the crystalline structure of the bars, if you like, and the pillars. And then there are the gerberettes that are more organic and are very visible, like a gargoyle in a Gothic church, which creates a rather interesting visual expression.
Once the structure of the building was entirely built, all that was left was to add the levels. Simple plateaus with nothing to impede them, no walls or pillars in the middle. The whole load-bearing structure was on the exterior. It was what we called an exostructure, a bit like Notre Dame with its flying buttresses. In 1976, after 9 months of assembly, the construction of the Centre Pompidou was finally complete. Steel gerberettes, coloured pipes and red escalators, all the striking elements of an iconic building were in place. One final detail was lacking, its visual identity. This was entrusted to an artistic legend, Jean Widmer. At the time, this Swiss designer already had a great career as an artistic director. In the 1960s, he revolutionized advertising and fashion with deconstructed page layouts and avant-garde typographical elements. With this series of minimalist posters, he was at the start of the 1970s a true manifesto for contemporary graphic art. For the visual identity of the Centre Pompidou, he would come up with a genius idea.
About 6 months before they opened, the Secretary-General said to me, "Widmer, we need a logo urgently." Spontaneously I answered, "I'll do the facade of the centre." "Bravo, super, great idea. Okay, you will have it next week." I went and sat in a restaurant opposite, and there were some napkins. And there you have it.
This logo became the emblem of the centre and would never change.
Graphic art has to be pure. It has to be simple. Otherwise it will become outdated. And with the simplest lines, we see how this escalator is the barometer of art.
Meanwhile, in the run-up to the opening in 1977, the press was intrigued by this new kind of centre, alternating between fascination and ridicule.
En France, on n'a pas de pétrole, mais on a des tuyaux. C'est la première idée qui m'est venue lorsque j'ai vu le plateau Beaubourg.
1st of February 1977, the Centre Pompidou opened its doors to the public. It was a colossal success. 35,000 people came through the doors on the first day, when only 3,000 had been expected.
The opening of the centre was an unimaginable influx of people. First of all, they came to see a sacrilegious building in the heart of Paris. This thing that all the press and all the televisions across the world have been talking about.
The contemporary galleries of the era on the ground floor were free, and so a considerable number of people went in. There were works of art all over the place. It wasn't built to welcome so very many people. I have the very precise memory of rushing through the rooms to protect the artworks.
Beneath it all, what was extraordinary, and no one realized, without that, it wouldn't have happened, was that we all experienced utopia. Nothing was as unfeasible as creating the Centre Pompidou, and that's probably why it worked.
President Pompidou's wishes had been fulfilled beyond his hopes. His Centre of Modern and Contemporary Art is today one of the most visited museums in the world. The building has survived through the years, and its architecture is still as modern. It is one of the must-visit places in Paris.
Its key strength, unquestionably, was to have withstood considerable visitor numbers because, since its opening on the 31st of January 1977, the Centre Pompidou has welcomed more than 200 million visitors, which is somewhat remarkable if we think that Paris is a heritage city. Tourists who come to Paris come to see the Louvre, of course they come to see Notre Dame, the Arc de Triomphe. Seeing the Pompidou Centre is not necessarily an obvious choice, which demonstrates the force of this architecture.
For their part, Piano and Rogers have both become legends of architecture. They have constructed numerous other buildings across the world, each having received the highest awards, like the Pritzker Prize, the Nobel Prize of Architecture. Their Centre Pompidou has itself become a masterpiece of 20th century art.